The title of this report is Uncharted Waters. And as you all know, a chart is a map. And so we're going to use this map to take a journey through the 21st century. With the 21st century, though, we're going to see the collision of two major trends, and perhaps unstoppable trends. The first trend is population growth. What we've done here on this map is something tremendously simple. We simply overlay the fertility rate, or population growth, with the availability of water. And what we see in the areas in red is water scarcity and water stress spreading and intensifying. And most of the places where water stress is intensifying are countries that are often poor, they're sometimes fragile, and they're sometimes in conflict. The second powerful trend that we have to contend with in the 21st century is climate change. There is much we could discuss about water and climate change, but for our purposes, we simply need to know that with climate change, rainfall will become more fickle, it will become more variable, and we will see more extreme events. Indeed, the staggering events that we saw with the hurricanes this year will become more common. But let's not rely on anecdote. Let's look at what the data actually tells us. Let's look at rainfall shocks, say, for example, dry rainfall events that we would expect to see occurring, say, once every 50 years. Let's look at the areas in orange. These are areas that have received a dry rainfall shock that should have occurred about once every 50 years for 6 out of 10 years. Look now at those red areas. These are areas that have received a dry rainfall shock that should have been rare about once every 50 years. They received a shock for 7 out of 10 years in the most recent decade for which we have data. No different when it comes to wet shocks. Look at the orange areas. These are areas that have received a dry rainfall shock that should be rare once in 50 years for 6 out of 10 years, and the red for 7 or more out of 10 years in the most recent decade that we have. So what we do in Uncharted Waters is take this intensifying growing water scarcity together with water variability, and we explore the impacts on the economy. And in particular, we start on the farm because we know that agriculture requires land and water, and because agriculture requires water, it will be on the front lines of the impact. Then we move to cities and firms. Cities are important because 80% of global GDP is produced in cities, so we need to understand what the impact is going to be on the city. At the center of this all, of course, are families and people. And we explore not just the economic impacts, but also many of the social dimensions to the extent to which we can find data. So let's begin on the farm. We ask what I think are probably 3 foundational questions. Firstly, we ask if there are rainfall fluctuations, if there are these dry and wet shocks of the kind that you saw, what is the impact on farm productivity? And here we'll confirm much of what you might have expected. Then we ask if you've had impacts on farm productivity, do these spill over and cascade into natural habitats and forests? It turns out that much has been conjectured and written about this, but there is no data, there is no statistical evidence to back the varying claims that we have. And we'll try to cast a little bit of light on this issue. Given that we have these impacts, it's incumbent upon us to ask what policies work. And we focus on infrastructure because it's so important and so costly. And we ask if it's worked, why has it worked? And if it has not worked, why and where has it not worked? So let's start by looking at impacts of rainfall fluctuations on farm productivity. Let's start with dry shocks. What we observe is that when dry shocks occur, agricultural productivity declines, and it declines by much more in arid areas because, of course, arid areas are sensitive to rainfall and need rain. This is pretty much what everyone would have expected. What can we say about wet shocks? Well, on the other hand, we find that wet shocks globally, this is a global average, are good for agricultural productivity. And the reason why they're good for agricultural productivity is simply because most agriculture occurs in places that receive less than the optimum amount of rainfall. Agronomists will tell you that on average the optimum amount of rainfall is somewhere between 1,000 millimeters to 1,200 millimeters of rain, of course depending on timing. So given that these dry shocks have an impact on productivity, there's likely to be some sort of effect on food scarcity and food security. So the next key issue to explore is what is the global impact on food security and what's the impact on particular countries. And of course, as you've just heard, what we find is that dry shocks lead to a loss of food production sufficient to feed about 81 million people. So that's 81 million people, which would be a country the size of, say, Germany or Turkey. And of course, these shocks are not occurring in Germany or Turkey. They're occurring in the poorest and the most arid parts of the world, those countries that were marked red on the first map that you saw. So we see the impact of rainfall shocks, dry shocks on agricultural productivity. Wet shocks have a good impact. Do any of these cascade and spill into natural habitats and forests? And as I said earlier, there's no statistical evidence of this. And there are perhaps two stories that we could tell. Suppose we get consecutive good episodes of rainfall. Then we know agricultural productivity will rise, agricultural profits will rise, and perhaps that might induce farmers to push into the forest frontier, assuming, of course, that the land is available. So that's one hypothesis. But we could tell another story too. Suppose we get bad episodes of rain, then farm incomes decline. To recover and recoup their incomes, farmers might also want to push into the forest frontier. So which is it going to be? Is it going to be the good episodes that induce expansion into the forests, or the dry episodes where you try to recover your income? What we find is that dry shocks lead to an expansion into the forest frontier, and the magnitude is about enough to explain 60% of global deforestation. So here is a driver of deforestation that we perhaps didn't pay enough attention to. What can we say about wet shocks? For wet shocks, we can find no statistically detectable impact on the forests. Now, this is a result overall that I think has far-reaching and important implications. So suppose dry shocks lead to the destruction of forests. This implies it leads to the destruction of watersheds. This implies that farmers are destroying the source of their water, because water is made in the watersheds. But the impacts could be worse, and they could also be global. If dry shocks lead to the destruction of forests, we are destroying our carbon sinks, which then worsens climate change. If that then induces more dry shocks, we get more deforestation, and we're clearly in a downward spiral, which is clearly a possibility. Given that you have these large impacts, both at a national level and a global level, what can we do about it? And we explore how effective is infrastructure, things like irrigation, canals, etc. And what we find is that in general, infrastructure is pretty effective. It provides a healthy boost to farm productivity, and it also buffers farmers against the ups and the downs of rainfall, which are inevitable. There is an exception, and an important exception, and this is in arid areas. What we find is that in these arid areas, when irrigation water is provided, and that water is provided for free, then farmers start growing water-thirsty crops such as rice, sugarcane, and cotton. These are the three most water-thirsty crops for which data is available. So then when a drought arrives, and the drought always arrives, there is insufficient water for these crops, farm production collapses, incomes collapse, and the farmers are worse off than they would have been without the infrastructure. That's right, worse off than they would have been without it. So this is an example of what climate scientists call maladaptation. Put very simply, it implies we have bad or perverse incentives. So what we're doing over here is in the middle of a desert, we are providing free water. So we are providing an economic signal that water is abundant when in fact that water is scarce. So we can't blame the farmers for responding to that perverse, bad economic signal. Now, the moral of the story, the policy implication, is not that you don't do the infrastructure, but that you couple the infrastructure with the right sorts of policies that seek to control demand, demand-side management policies. It could sometimes take the form of pricing, though that's very difficult in water. It could take the form of water trading schemes. It could take the form of quotas and so on. The solution will, of course, vary by country. So given that we've seen these large impacts on the farm, The next obvious question is, what is the impact on families and on people? And here we focus our analysis on Africa. And in particular, we focus on women in Africa. That's because there is this wonderful data set called the Demographic and Health Surveys, and this provides us with very detailed information about women, about their health status, about their economic status, and a lot about their social conditions too, like how many children they have, the status of their children, when they got married, and so on. We take our inspiration from the literature in public health and health economics. What all of that literature tells us is that if a child in her infancy encounters deprivations, then that child misses out on episodes of growth, and that child will not grow to her full mental or her full physical potential. So if a child faces a deprivation such as, say, a lack of food or a bout of diarrhea, she misses out on those growth episodes and will not reach her full cognitive potential or her full genetic physical potential. So knowing this fact, we ask what is perhaps an audacious and overly bold question. We ask, if a child encounters a rainfall shock in her infancy, does this affect her later on in life as an adult woman? So we have data about her today. We know her status, her health, her wealth, her family status. We know when she was born. We know the episode of rainfall when she was born. We ask if a dry or wet shock when she was born in the first 1,000 days of your life have any impact 20, 30 years on, after, of course, making all of the statistical corrections. What do we find? Let's start with the dry rainfall shocks. We know when we have a dry rainfall shock, there is less food, the child is likely to be malnourished, the child will not grow to her full mental potential. She spends fewer years in education, she leaves school early. Because she has less human capital, she has less wealth, and she is poorer. Only in cases of extreme dry rainfall episodes do we find an impact on height, do we find that she is stunted. What about wet rainfall shocks? Now there's more food, so we find more time spent in education, more wealth, the person is richer as an adult, but we can find no impact on height. Now, given the power and given the importance of these results that we've found about a single rainfall shock in your infancy affecting you down the track, we need to track whether there are other impacts as well. And we look at some of the social dimensions. We find if there was a dry shock in your infancy, we know you end up with less education and less wealth, you're poorer. This woman ends up getting married earlier. She has more children, and she's also likely to be more accepting of inter-partner violence. There's a question in the survey about, do you think inter-partner violence is okay? And these women are more likely to say yes. But it doesn't stop there. There are intergenerational impacts. We know the biometrics of her children, and we find that her children are less nourished and her children are less healthy. So this is a classic case of a poverty trap, where a rainfall shock in a child's infancy becomes her destiny as an adult, and even more tragically, becomes the destiny of her children in the next generation. This is a horrifying result. Given that we found this result, we then asked what sort of policies worked. We tried to test for infrastructure, and we found infrastructure certainly helps, but it does not help enough. The reason why it does not help enough is that you're still poor, and you're still vulnerable to these shocks, these dry shocks when they come. And we argue very forcefully in the report is what we really require in these vulnerable areas is safety nets. And they could take many forms. They could take the form of drought insurance, workfare scheme, income support. But we need these safety nets when these dry shocks actually occur. All right, now that is not the cheeriest of results to find. Let's move to the city and see if things improve in the city. And we focus a lot of our attention on firms in the city. And as I said earlier, that's because so much of global GDP is produced in the city. There's been a lot of research done on the impact of floods in cities, but we know very little about the impacts on droughts. And we give both equal attention. So what do we find? We find when there are small shocks, be they wet or dry in the city, there is no discernible statistical impact that we can find on either incomes or on employment levels. However, when there are large shocks, be they wet or dry, certainly incomes and employment levels fall. Perhaps this is an unsurprising result because we know that cities have reasonable infrastructure, so they are buffered against small shocks. We also know that most incomes in cities are not directly reliant upon rainfall like a farmer's income is. So it should be no surprise that small shocks don't actually have an impact that we can detect. But what is perhaps immensely surprising, as Laura told us, is that the impact of a dry shock is 4 times greater than the impact of a wet shock. And this is not something that we are accustomed to, so let me repeat that. The impact of a dry shock is 4 times greater than the impact of a wet shock. To understand why we find this result, we need to understand the pathways and we need to understand the policy response that we typically observe. So what are the pathways? What happens when you get a dry shock? Of course, when you get a dry shock, you have less water. As most of you know, almost all forms of energy require water, quite a lot of water very often. There's less water, you get more power outages. This slows the economy of the city generally. What we also observe is that when there is less water, there is a greater incidence of diseases in the city, diseases such as diarrhea. Why might that occur? When there's less water, we know that water quality deteriorates. One might also conjecture that when there's less water, this alters behavior. For example, there's less water to wash your hands, and that too would lead to a spread of disease. But what we do see in countries where we have the data is a spike in the hospitalization rate. Now, all of that is, of course, going to feed through into the economy. So what we find is that sales of formal firms decline by about 9%, whereas sales of informal firms fall by about 35%. And as we know in developing countries, informal is the normal form of employment. This is an impact that affects very many more people. So really what we are seeing occurring with droughts is silent and less visible damage that is done in slow motion. Contrast that with a flood. Suppose you have a flood. It washes away a bridge. It brings in the media. It brings in the television cameras. The television cameras bring in the politicians, and that brings in the reconstruction aid. With droughts, it's less visible, so the aid is slower to flow through if it ever does. Perhaps an analogy is to say that consider a disease that is undetected. If it's undetected and undiagnosed, it goes untreated. It probably does a lot of damage. On the other hand, there could be a much worse disease. As long as it's actually diagnosed, it gets treated, nipped in the bud perhaps, it therefore does less damage. So this is misery and damage in slow motion that is silent, and therefore it tends to get ignored. Now, given the scale of impacts across so many sectors, what are the policy implications? What can we do to reverse this parched path and to build resilience? Because so many sectors are involved, unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, no one policy, there is no single panacea that we can propose that will resolve all of these impacts and all of these policies. Instead, what we need to do is to think about a portfolio of policies. And we need a portfolio of policies almost like a chain of policies that are linked. And as we know with any chain, it's only as strong as its weakest link. So we need to pay attention to all of those links along the chain. So what are some of the key links along that chain? Let's look at this infographic to tell a story through it. Let's start at the very top of the infographic where it says the water source. At its source, water is an environmental good. To protect that environmental good and the source of water, we need environmental policies to protect the watersheds. But that environmental good is not particularly useful. We can't use it. So we need infrastructure. We need things like dams, we need canals, and we need pipes to convert that environmental good into an economic good. But it's perhaps worth reflecting for a moment. The technology that we use today for our dams and our pipes is the same technology essentially that was used by the ancient Romans thousands of years ago. They had dams and they had clay pipes. And indeed, the oldest dam still in operation is about 2,000 years old. It is the Kalanai Dam in southern India. So you would think we should and could do better in terms of our technology. Well, anyway, be that as it may, we take that water and we deliver it to farms. And we have seen if we deliver that water to farms and we deliver it for free, we provide the wrong kinds of economic signals. And then what we find is that farmers are growing the wrong sorts of goods, and the wrong sorts of crops, should I say. And as a consequence, we increase vulnerability. So we need what economists call demand-side management policies to provide the right sorts of incentives. And just to repeat, that's going to vary by country. There's no one-size-fits-all that you can have. We deliver the water to cities and to firms in the cities. And there, really the key to getting it right is regulating our utilities better. And the problem is this in the city, is that water utilities are what's called a natural monopoly. Think about it. There can only be one pipe that comes to your home. If there's only one pipe, there's only one owner of that pipe, and that owner is the monopolist. So like any monopolist, what we often find is that there is plenty of scope for efficiency gains. And what we do in this report is we bring insights from game theory and contract theory to suggest how we could better regulate these natural monopolies, these water utilities, to assure a more resilient and affordable supply of water. Of course, many of them do very well. When we turn to the families, we know particularly families in rural areas do require safety nets in whatever form that they actually come to protect them from the impact of droughts. Finally, all that water, as we know, is inevitably returned back into the system. So we have to worry about the quality of water so one person doesn't do harm to another. So once again, we need environmental policies to protect each other. So what we require, just to re-emphasize this, is not a single policy, but a portfolio of policies. It's very different, for example, from, say, climate change mitigation. We know that with climate change mitigation, if we can get a carbon price, very many things will start going right. With water, suppose we have a price for, say, firms and cities, for city water supply, that's not going to help us terribly much on the farm. Suppose we get both of those prices, that's not necessarily going to help us in protecting the water sources. So we still do require a variety of policies and a variety of sectors to work together. And that is, of course, immensely challenging. So in conclusion, let me end with a quote from Toni Morrison, who many of you will know is a great American author. So Toni Morrison once said, if something is really important, it's really hard. This is hard, but let's not focus on how hard it is. Let's focus on how important it is to get it right. And if we do, then we can avoid the crises of today from becoming the catastrophes of tomorrow. Thank you so much. Poor, they're sometimes fragile, and they're sometimes in conflict. The second powerful trend that we have to contend with in the 21st century is climate change. There is much we could discuss about water and climate change, but for our purposes, we simply need to know that with climate change, rainfall will become more fickle, it will become more variable, and we will see more extreme events. You know, indeed, the staggering events that we saw with the hurricanes this year will become more common. But let's not rely on anecdote. Let's look at what the data actually tells us. Let's look at rainfall shocks, say, for example, dry rainfall events that we would expect to see occurring, say, once every 50 years. Let's look at the areas in orange. These are areas that have received a dry rainfall shock that should have occurred about once every 50 years for 6 out of 10 years. Look now at those red areas. These are areas that have received a dry rainfall shock that should have been rare about once every 50 years. They received a shock for 7 out of 10 years in the most recent decade for which we have data. No different when it comes to wet shocks. Look at the orange areas. These are areas that have received a dry rainfall shock that should be rare once in 50 years for 6 out of 10 years, and the red for 7 or more out of 10 years in the most recent decade that we to the extent to which we we can find data. So let's begin on the farm. We ask what I think are probably three foundational questions. Firstly, we ask if there are rainfall fluctuations, if there are these dry and wet shocks of the kind that you saw, what is the impact on farm productivity? And here we'll confirm much of what you might have expected. Then we ask if you've had impacts on farm productivity, do these spill over and cascade into natural habitats and forests? It turns out that much has been conjectured and written about this, but there is no data, there is no statistical evidence to back the varying claims that we have. And we'll try to cast a little bit of light on this issue. The title of this report is Uncharted Waters. And as you all know, a chart is a map. And so we're going to use this map to take a journey through the 21st century. With the 21st century, though, we're going to see the collision of two major trends, and perhaps unstoppable trends. The first trend is population growth. What we've done here on this map is something tremendously simple. We simply overlay the fertility rate, or population growth, with the availability of water. And what we see in the areas in red is water scarcity and water stress spreading and intensifying. And most of the places where water stress is intensifying are countries that are often we have. So what we do in Uncharted Waters is take this intensifying growing water scarcity together with water variability, and we explore the impacts on the economy. And in particular, we start on the farm because we know that agriculture requires land and water, and because agriculture requires water, it will be on the front lines of the impact. Then we move to cities and firms. Cities are important because 80% of global GDP is produced in cities, so we need to understand what the impact is going to be on the city. At the center of this all, of course, are families and people. And we explore not just the economic impacts, but also many of the social dimensions